The neighbors laughed and told him he wouldn't survive the winter. A retired veteran worn down by years of loss chose to build his cabin inside a mountain cave, something no one in town would dare attempt. With only his loyal German shepherd by his side, he ignored every warning as the first snow began to fall. But when the blizzard of the century struck and temperatures plunged far below zero, that cave revealed a truth no one expected. What began as mockery turned into desperation, and one man's quiet wisdom ended up saving an entire community. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always powerful to see how far these stories travel. Winter settled over Leadville, Colorado, with knife-sharp alpine winds that scraped skin and memory alike. At the far edge of town, where the Rocky Mountains rose into pale limestone scars, Walter Hayes appeared every morning like a figure carved out of the cold itself. He was a man in his early 70s, tall but slightly bowed at the shoulders, the posture of someone who had spent decades carrying invisible weight. His face was long and angular cheekbones, sharp jaw set hard beneath a beard, gone mostly gray, but still thick, trimmed, short out of habit rather than vanity. Deep lines framed his eyes, not just from age, but from years of squinting into sun, snow, and smoke. He wore the same heavy red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket every day, faded at the elbows, darkened with old stains of sap and soot layered over a wool sweater that had belonged to someone long gone. In one gloved hand he carried an axe, its handle polished smooth by time. At his side walked Shadow, an aging German shepherd, with a broad chest, silver dark fur frosted with white. Along the muzzle, amber eyes, still alert despite the stiffness in his gait. Shadow was 12, maybe 13, his left ear permanently bent from an old injury, his loyalty unquestioned. The two of them moved with the quiet coordination of beings who had survived storms together, human and animal, bound by routines that required no words. Leadville was a town built on endurance and pride, a place where people measured worth by how well you could face winter without complaint. Walter had lived there for 6 years, long enough for people to know his name but not his story. They knew he was a veteran, that much was obvious from the way he stood too straight when startled and the way loud noises made his jaw tighten before he relaxed it again. Few knew the specifics, fewer asked. Walter himself rarely spoke of it. War to him was not a story, but a weather pattern that never fully cleared. He had learned long ago that explaining pain did not lessen it. So he worked. He cut wood, repaired tools, helped when asked, declined invitations when they came. Shadow was his constant, the only living creature who had seen him wake up shaking in the middle of the night and pretend nothing was wrong by morning. The laughter began the day Walter told the town what he intended to do. It happened at the feed store, a low building that smelled of grain dust and old oil where men gathered to talk weather and prices. Walter mentioned almost casually that he had found a south-facing cave in the limestone ridge above town and planned to build his cabin inside it. The room went quiet for a moment, then filled with chuckles that grew into open laughter. One man slapped another on the shoulder. Someone shook their head. "You'll freeze in there," a voice said. "Stone holds cold." Another added, "That's not a house, that's a grave." Walter stood there listening, his expression unchanged, yet steady as if he were hearing something he had heard before in another place, another life. He nodded once, paid for his supplies, and left without arguing. Shadow followed, tail low but calm, already sensing the familiar pattern, humans talking loudly, meaning little. What none of them understood was that Walter Hayes had survived places far colder than Leadville, places where the ground itself seemed hostile, where warmth was a luxury measured in minutes. During his service, he had learned to read terrain the way others read maps. A hill could block wind. A hollow could trap cold. Stone, when treated properly, could become an ally instead of an enemy. He had learned these lessons the hard way during a winter deployment overseas, when poorly placed shelters had cost men their fingers, their toes, sometimes their lives. One night, trapped in a rocky outcrop under artillery fire, he had noticed how the stone overhead absorbed heat from their bodies and released it slowly, keeping them alive until dawn. That memory had stayed with him sharper than metals, heavier than regret. It was not nostalgia that guided his choice now. It was calculation. The cave sat halfway up the slope, its mouth wide enough to swallow a truck, its ceiling arching high before narrowing into darkness. Even on the coldest days, the air inside felt different, steady, unmoved by the wind that howled outside. Walter had stood there for hours, when he first found it, listening to the silence, feeling the temperature, with his palms pressed against stone. Shadow had paced, sniffed, then settled near the back wall, as if he too sensed safety. Walter took that as confirmation. Animals, he believed, understood shelter better than men. As weeks passed and Walter began hauling timber uphill, the laughter followed him. Neighbors watched from below as he dragged logs one by one, resting often, his breath clouding thick in the air. Among those watching was Thomas Whitaker, a former construction foreman in his late 50s, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, with a red face and hands permanently roughened by work. Thomas was not cruel by nature, but he was practical to the point of stubbornness. He had built 3 houses in his life and trusted what he could measure and nail down. To him, Walter's project looked like madness. "Man's wasting his strength," Thomas said more than once, spitting into the snow. "Could build twice the space down here." Walter heard the comments, absorbed them without reaction. He had learned long ago that explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding was another form of exhaustion. At night, back in his temporary trailer, Walter lay awake, listening to the wind batter the thin walls. Shadow curled against his legs for warmth. He thought about age, about how the body kept score, even when the mind wanted to forget. His hands ached now when they hadn't before. His knees complained on the climb. There were moments, brief but dangerous, when doubt crept in. He wondered if the town was right, if he was chasing an idea rooted too deeply in old memories. Each time that thought surfaced, Shadow would shift place, his heavy head on Walter's thigh, breathe slow and steady. The simple presence grounded him. If the dog believed the cave was right, that was enough for now. By the time the first serious snow fell, the shape of the cabin had begun to emerge inside the cave's mouth. It sat set back from the entrance, protected from direct wind, framed by stone on 3 sides. Walter worked methodically, his movements economical, every cut measured, every notch precise. He spoke to Shadow while he worked, not in full sentences, but in the low murmurs of companionship, as if narrating his thoughts aloud kept them orderly. Passers-by sometimes climbed partway up the slope to watch curiosity slowly replacing ridicule. They noticed things that unsettled them, the way the cave blocked the wind completely, the way frost never seemed to form deep inside, the way Walter never rushed, as if time itself bent slightly around him. Walter felt the eyes on him and carried on. He was not building to impress or to prove anyone wrong. He was building because winter was coming, and he had learned the cost of being unprepared. Somewhere inside him lived the memory of men who had laughed at warnings, once men who had assumed experience alone would save them. It hadn't. As the days shortened and the mountains darkened earlier, each evening Walter Hayes drove his axe into the frozen ground outside the cave and rested his hands on the handle, breathing in the cold air. Shadow stood beside him, ears forward, watching the valley below. The laughter still drifted up the slope on clear days, thin and distant now, already losing its edge. Winter, Walter knew, had a way of teaching lessons no voice could deliver. Walter never thought of the cave as a home. To him, it was a shield shaped by patience rather than comfort. As December crept closer, the sun barely cleared the ridge before sliding away again, leaving long blue shadows stretched across the slope. Each morning, Walter climbed toward the cave with measured steps, his breath controlled the way it had been drilled into him decades earlier. Shadow always went first, moving with quiet authority, nose close to the ground, pausing at every shift in wind. The dog's body told a story of age and endurance, hips stiff in the cold, fur coarse and thick scarred lightly along the flank, where barbed wire had once caught him years ago. But his instincts remained sharp. When Shadow growled low at a sudden gust funneled through a narrow crack in the rock, Walter paid attention. He had learned long ago that ignoring early warnings was how men got buried. Inside the cave, the work grew more deliberate. Walter positioned the cabin deeper than anyone expected, far enough that the stone ceiling absorbed the heat of the day and released it slowly at night, but not so deep that air would stagnate. He spoke aloud, sometimes explaining his choices, as if addressing an invisible audience, perhaps the ghosts of men who had once doubted him in other winters. War had taught him that cold was not an enemy you fought head-on. It was something you redirected, diverted, tricked into settling where it could do the least harm. During one winter campaign overseas, his unit had lost 2 men because a temporary shelter was built in a shallow dip that collected freezing air. Walter had watched the medics shake their heads helpless. That memory surfaced now as he carved channels beneath the floor, narrow spaces, designed to pull cold air away from where bodies would sleep. Every cut of his knife, every placement of stone felt like a conversation with that past, a quiet refusal to repeat its mistakes. By midweek, the sound of chopping echoed off the rock face, sharp and rhythmic. That was when Sarah Whitaker first climbed the slope to see what all the stubbornness was about. Sarah was in her early 50s, tall and lean, her posture upright in a way that suggested she had once danced or played sports before life bent her toward practicality. Her hair, once a deep brown, had faded into a sun-streaked auburn, pulled back into a low braid that brushed the collar of her coat. Her skin was pale, weathered slightly by altitude and years of outdoor work, and her eyes, gray and observant, missed very little. She had lived in Leadville most of her life, married, young, widowed, younger than she'd expected after a mining accident took her husband. That loss had shaped her into someone cautious, but not cruel, skeptical, but curious. Where others laughed loudly, Sarah watched quietly. She stood at the cave's edge for several minutes before Walter noticed her. Shadow did first, lifting his head and letting out a short, questioning bark. Walter turned, axe resting against his shoulder, and nodded once in greeting. Sarah returned the nod, hands tucked into her coat pockets, taking in the structure forming behind him. "People are saying you've finally lost it," she said, not unkindly. "I wanted to see for myself." Walter studied her face, gauging intent. He saw no mockery there, only concern, mixed with something like respect. "They've said worse about better ideas," he replied. Sarah smiled faintly at that. She stepped closer, peering at the raised floor and the stone-lined channels beneath. "You're moving the cold," she said slowly, as if testing the thought out loud. Walter looked at her, then really looked, and nodded. "Cold always wants somewhere to settle," he said. "You just have to give it a place that isn't you." Sarah didn't stay long, but when she left, she did so thoughtfully, glancing back once as if committing the sight to memory. She told no one what she'd seen, not right away. That silence, Walter would later realize, mattered more than praise. The following days brought others less sympathetic. Thomas Whitaker came again, boots crunching loudly on frozen ground, his breath sharp with irritation. He watched Walter install the stone heater, a compact structure with internal channels that snaked heat through dense rock before releasing smoke outside. Thomas frowned, arms crossed over his chest. "That thing's too small," he said. "You'll be feeding it all night." Walter wiped sweat from his brow, leaving a dark smear on his glove. "Hot fires," he said. "Short ones. Stone does the rest." Thomas shook his head, muttered something about wasted effort, and left. Walter let him go. He had learned in war that some men needed proof written in frost. Nights grew colder. Inside the cave, Walter lit the heater for the first time, watching how the stone responded, feeling the warmth radiate slowly, evenly. Shadow lay stretched out near the wall, sighing as heat seeped into old joints. Walter sat on an overturned crate and allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. The cave smelled of stone and fresh wood, clean and grounding. For the first time since arriving in Leadville, he slept without waking to the memory of distant explosions, without the reflexive tightening of muscles at imagined threats. Stone did that, he realized. It reminded the body that it was held, yet doubt lingered at the edges. Walter knew theories failed all the time when tested by reality. He tested everything twice then, once more adjusting vents, sealing gaps with clay and grass, listening to how the wind moved around the entrance. He talked to Shadow as he worked, asking questions he already knew the answers to. The dog responded with presence rather than sound, a steady reassurance that mattered more than logic. By the end of the week, snow fell heavier, the kind that muffled sound and altered distance. From the valley below, the cave cabin looked smaller now, almost insignificant against the mountain. Laughter still drifted up on occasion, but it sounded thinner, uncertain. Walter drove his last stake into the ground and stepped back, studying the structure with a critical eye. It wasn't finished, but it was ready enough. War had taught him another lesson too. Waiting for perfect conditions was a luxury rarely afforded. You prepared as best you could and trusted the rest to discipline and adaptation. As darkness settled, Walter stood at the cave mouth beside Shadow, watching lights flicker on in town below. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the awareness that the real test had not yet arrived. Winter always came with its own verdict. He rested a hand on Shadow's broad head, fingers sinking into warm fur, and allowed himself one quiet thought he would never say aloud. If he was wrong, it would only cost him. If he was right, it might save more than he intended. By mid-November, the temperature in Leadville fell hard and fast, the kind of cold that did not announce itself with drama, but with certainty, slipping into bones and wood alike. Nights grew longer, stars sharper, and the valley below the ridge glowed with the orange pulse of stoves fed hour after hour. Down there, families learned the rhythm of survival again. Wake, feed the fire, sleep, lightly wake to feed it again. Up on the slope inside the cave, Walter Hayes worked in rolled sleeves, the steady warmth wrapping the small cabin in a way that felt almost unreal. He sat at a narrow workbench near the stone wall, sanding a chair leg with slow precision, the rasp of wood softened by the cave's depth. Shadow lay stretched near the masonry heater, his thick flank rising and falling, paws twitching, as if chasing something only he could see. The dog's silvered muzzle caught the light from the fire, and Walter found himself watching him with an expression that softened the hard lines of his face. He had seen many men age badly, turning brittle angry at time itself. Shadow had aged differently, slower with dignity, accepting stiffness without complaint. It reminded Walter of the kind of man he still wanted to be. The first rumors reached him before the first real storm. A man from town climbed the slope one afternoon and stood awkwardly at the cave's edge, hands shoved deep into his coat. His name was Leonard Price, a thin man in his 40s, with a narrow face and restless eyes, known for talking more than listening. Leonard worked at the hardware store and had a habit of collecting stories the way others collected tools, often without checking their usefulness. People are saying things, Leonard said, peering inside as if expecting to see something impossible. They say there's steam coming out of the mountain at night. They say you found hot water up here. Walter looked up from his work, eyebrow lifting slightly. They're welcome to come feel the stone, he said. Leonard laughed nervously, waved it off, and left, already rehearsing how he'd retell the visit. Walter watched him go, feeling neither anger nor satisfaction. Rumors were easier for people than admitting ignorance. He had seen that pattern before in briefings gone wrong, and blame shifted upward or sideways until truth became unrecognizable. As the days shortened further, more people noticed what they could not explain. Sarah Whitaker came again, this time with her coat unbuttoned inside the cave, cheeks flushed from the climb rather than cold. She stood with her hands extended toward the stone wall, eyes closed for a moment, as if listening through her skin. "It's steady," she said quietly. "Not hot, just held." Walter nodded. "That's the idea." Sarah looked at him, then really looked, taking in the careful way he moved, the absence of wasted motion. "You don't build like someone hoping," she said. "You build like someone who expects to be tested." Walter smiled faintly at that, the closest he came to agreement aloud. Sarah stayed longer this time, asked questions. He answered plainly, without evangelizing. She left with more understanding than she'd arrived with, though she kept that understanding mostly to herself. In Leadville, wisdom spread slowly, often disguised as practicality. Below, skepticism hardened into something sharper. Thomas Whitaker grew increasingly irritated, his own nights sleepless as his stove consumed wood faster than he liked to admit. He told anyone who would listen that Walter's warmth had to be a trick, that no honest structure could behave that way. "Stone sucks heat," he insisted, voice rising. "Everyone knows that." His wife, Margaret Whitaker, listened quietly from the doorway of their cabin. Margaret was a woman worn thin by years of balancing fear and necessity, her frame compact and strong hair the color of ash pulled into a bun. She redid every morning with care that bordered on ritual. Her eyes, dark and thoughtful, had seen enough hardship to make her cautious about absolutes. She said little, but when she heard Thomas rant, she felt something like doubt stir beneath loyalty. Cold had a way of making doubt louder. The first real storm arrived without spectacle, a dense fall of snow that erased sound and softened the landscape. Walter stood at the cave's mouth as it began, watching flakes drift sideways, then settle gently where the rock shielded them. Inside, the temperature barely shifted. He added a short, hot fire that evening and felt the stone respond like a living thing storing warmth patiently. As the wind picked up overnight, he woke once, heart pounding, a reflex from another life. He listened, realized the sound was only wind skimming over stone, and lay back down. Shadow never lifted his head. By morning, the valley was quiet in a way that signaled trouble. Smoke hung low, trapped by cold air, and the usual sounds of movement were absent. Walter ventured outside, briefly clearing the chimney and checking the entrance. The cold struck hard, biting exposed skin within seconds. He retreated quickly, breathing easier as warmth reclaimed him. That contrast, brutal cold outside, calm heat within, settled something in his chest. The cave was doing what it was meant to do. It was speaking back to winter in a language older than pride. Over the next week, the cold deepened. The town burned through wood tempers, shortening along with daylight. People began to watch the mountain more closely. They noticed that Walter's door opened and closed at regular intervals, that he was not constantly feeding the fire. They noticed Shadow sometimes lying just outside the cave on clearer afternoons, basking in weak sun, unconcerned. The rumors shifted tone. They became quieter, edged with unease. Leonard Price started telling people Walter had military technology, something experimental. Another man suggested the mountain itself was warm, that maybe volcanic activity had been overlooked. No one wanted the explanation that required humility. Walter felt the shift too, though he rarely went into town now. He focused on small tasks, refining airflow, adjusting stones. He tested the cabin the way he once tested men, pushing, gently observing response. Each night he sat by the heater and let his thoughts wander to places he usually avoided. He remembered a winter long ago when laughter had echoed in a barracks before a storm, when confidence had outpaced preparation. The laughter had stopped then too, but too late for some. That memory sharpened his resolve. If the cold came harder, as it often did, he wanted to be ready not just for himself. The storm that followed was different. It arrived with wind that howled through the valley, bending trees and carrying ice like grit. From inside the cave, Walter heard it change pitch as it struck rock and was forced upward away. Snow piled at the entrance, but not violently. He cleared it methodically, retreating often to warm himself. Down below, the sound of metal striking metal echoed faintly, stoves being adjusted, pipes knocked free of ice. Walter paused, listening. There was a voice in the cold now, and it was not laughing. It was asking questions. As night fell on the second day of the storm, Walter sat with his back against the stone wall, eyes closed, feeling the heat seep through his flannel and into his spine. Shadow shifted closer, pressing his weight against Walter's leg. The dog's presence was grounding, a reminder that survival was not theoretical. It was tactile, immediate. Walter opened his eyes and looked toward the cave mouth, now framed by swirling white beyond the threshold. He felt no triumph, only a steady awareness that what he had built was about to matter more than opinions ever had. The cold had found its voice, and soon it would demand answers. The blizzard arrived like artillery, sudden and merciless, the wind screaming across Leadville with a violence that rattled windows and memory alike. Snow fell not downward, but sideways, driven in sheets that erased distance and direction, piling fast against doors and roofs until familiar shapes vanished. In the valley, cabins groaned under the weight, stovepipes shuddered, and seams that had held for years surrendered to the cold. Children cried into wool scarves, breath-puffing white, even indoors. Adults moved with a brittle urgency, feeding fires that burned too hot and too fast, praying iron would not crack before dawn. Up on the slope, the cave absorbed the noise and returned only a low, steady hush, as if the mountain itself had decided to stand between winter and whatever sheltered inside. Walter Hayes woke to the storm the way he used to wake to shelling, alert, but controlled. He counted breaths, listened to the wind's pitch change as it struck stone and lifted away. The heater glowed softly, its warmth spreading through the dense rock with patient certainty. Shadow rose, ears erect, a deep warning rumble in his chest. Walter pulled on his flannel and boots and checked the entrance. Snow had begun to bank, but not dangerously. He cleared the chimney with practiced motions, retreating often to warm himself, then returned inside to add a brief hot fire. He did not overfeed it. Panic wasted fuel. Discipline preserved it. Near midnight, amid the roar, a sound cut through that did not belong to weather. It was irregular, weak, the dull thud of something striking wood without rhythm. Shadow barked sharply and rushed to the door, body angled forward, hackles raised. Walter felt the old switch flip inside him, the part that sorted threat from plea in seconds. He opened the door into a wall of white and stepped out, leaning into the wind. The cold hit like a slap, breath burning in his lungs. He followed the sound downslope, moving in short bursts, then stopping, listening. A shape emerged through the snow, then another. A man stumbled, carrying a bundle wrapped in blankets, his beard iced, white eyes wild with effort. Behind him, a woman dragged a makeshift sled, her shoulders hunched, face pinched with fear. The man was Thomas Whitaker, broad shoulders now sagging, his usual confidence stripped bare by cold. His beard, once neatly trimmed, was stiff with frost. His hands shook as he shifted the bundle, revealing the small, pale face of his youngest child. The woman was Margaret Whitaker, compact and strong. Even now her ash-colored hair pulled loose from its bun cheeks, mottled red and white. She moved with grim determination, jaw clenched, refusing to stop. Walter did not ask questions. He took the child, felt how light the body was, how shallow the breathing. Inside, he said, voice carrying just enough authority to cut through panic. Shadow circled, barking once, then trotted ahead, leading them toward the cave mouth. It took them long minutes to cover what should have been a short distance. Inside, warmth closed around them like a living thing. Margaret collapsed to her knees, clutching her middle child, a girl with dark hair plastered to her forehead, eyes too large for her face. Thomas stood rigid for a heartbeat, then sagged, shame and relief colliding until tears carved lines through frost on his cheeks. Walter set the smallest child near the heater, wrapped him in dry blankets, and moved with quiet efficiency, water heating space, clearing food portioned without fuss. Shadow lay across the threshold, broad back to the wind, the last barrier between chaos and shelter. By morning the storm had worsened. Wind speeds rose, snow deepened, and Leadville fell silent in a way that meant trouble. Walter stepped outside again to clear the chimney and door, then heard voices carried on the gale, shouts, desperate and raw. He went out without hesitation, returning an hour later, with two more figures, James Kincaid and his wife Ellen. James was a narrow, sharp-featured man in his early 60s, shoulders stooped by years of solitary labor, his hair thin and iron gray. He had always kept to himself, a man shaped by pride and quiet routines, but now his hands trembled openly as he half-carried Ellen. She was tall and slender, skin waxen with cold, her long blonde hair braided loosely, lips tinged blue. Walter recognized hypothermia's signs instantly, the confusion, the slowed responses. He warmed her carefully, speaking softly, as he would to a frightened recruit, grounding her in the present. The second night blurred into the third. The cave cabin filled with bodies and breath, with whispered conversations and shared silence. Sarah Whitaker arrived late on the second day, face drawn, but eyes steady, leading her teenage son by the hand. She had resisted leaving her own home until the cold forced the decision, the stove coughing smoke into the room and refusing to draw. She took in the crowded space without comment, assessed what needed doing, and set herself to work with the competence of someone who had learned to adapt quickly after loss. She rationed food, organized bedding, and calmed children with a voice that carried authority without sharpness. Walter noticed how she moved efficient, aware of others, never stepping into someone's space without need. She met his eyes once, a brief exchange of gratitude and understanding that required no words. The storm pressed on. Snow climbed the cave mouth, threatening to choke airflow. Walter rotated watch duties, careful to keep the chimney clear. Each trip outside was a calculated risk, mitigated by the warmth he could return to. Down in the valley, there was no such refuge. Fires burned furniture, fence posts, anything combustible. The cold did not care. By the third day, more came. Samuel Morrison arrived with his wife, Catherine, and their son, Robert. The boy's face pinched with fear, Catherine's movements slow and unfocused. Samuel was a tall man with a scholar's stoop and a thinker's frown, beard unkempt, now pride stripped away. He did not argue or explain. He simply asked hoarsely if there was room. Walter made room. 11 people crowded into a space meant for far fewer. It should have been suffocating. It was not. The stone absorbed moisture. The ventilation channels breathed quietly. The heater worked steadily. The children slept in shifts, curled together like puppies. Adults shared stories in low voices to pass the hours, trading small kindnesses, an extra blanket, a sip of warm broth. Thomas Whitaker watched Walter tend the fire with precise timing eyes, following every movement. The man who had laughed now studied learning. Margaret caught Walter's sleeve once her grip firm. "Thank you," she said, voice thick. Walter nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude, but accepting it nonetheless. On the fourth morning, the wind finally slackened. The storm did not end so much as tire. Snow fell straight down at last, heavy and quiet. Walter stood at the cave mouth and surveyed the damage below roofs, bowed paths, buried smoke, thin and uncertain. He felt no triumph, only a sober recognition of how close the line had been. Inside, Shadow slept at last, exhausted, but content his duty fulfilled. Walter leaned against the stone, closed his eyes, and let the mountain hold the weight for a moment longer. The blizzard had spared no one, but it had revealed something harder than pride and warmer than fire, the simple power of preparation shared without judgment. When the blizzard finally loosened its grip, Leadville did not celebrate. The town emerged slowly, as if afraid the mountain might notice movement and call the storm back. Roofs were bowed or blackened where desperate fires had burned too hot. Woodpiles were gone, reduced to memories and ash. Doors opened cautiously, and people stepped into a silence heavier than the snow itself. Breath rose in pale clouds, and no one laughed when they looked up toward the limestone ridge. The cave was no longer a punchline. It was a reference point. Walter Hayes waited until the wind settled before leading people back down the slope in small groups, making sure those weakened by cold moved carefully. He walked last, as he always had, counting heads, checking footing, Shadow pacing at his side like a sentry released from duty, but not vigilance. The dog looked older now, movements slower, eyes rimmed with red from smoke and exhaustion, yet he carried himself with quiet pride. He had guarded the threshold through the worst of it, and that mattered to him in ways only Walter fully understood. In the days that followed, people came not to gawk, but to ask. They climbed the ridge in daylight, hats in hand, voices low, studying the cave with a respect that bordered on reverence. Thomas Whitaker was among the first. He stood at the entrance, longer than most broad shoulders, slumped beard untrimmed, the lines around his eyes deeper. He watched Walter adjust a stone near the heater, then cleared his throat. "I was wrong," Thomas said. He did not dress it up or soften it. The words came heavy but clean. Walter looked up, met his gaze, and nodded once. He did not offer absolution or lectures. In war, apologies were rare and valuable. You accepted them without ceremony. Thomas asked questions then about airflow, about stone mass, about fire timing, and listened without interrupting. Something in him had shifted, cracked open by cold and fear, and the sight of his children sleeping warm while the storm raged outside. That crack let light in. Sarah Whitaker came later, moving with the same composed efficiency she had shown during the storm. She had dark circles under her eyes now, but her posture remained upright, purposeful. She brought bread and dried meat, set them down without fuss, and stood beside Walter as he worked. "They're talking," she said quietly. "Not rumors this time. Plans." Walter glanced at her, a question in his eyes. "They want to build differently," she continued. "Some are scared to admit it out loud, but they're watching." Sarah's gaze moved across the valley where men measured slopes and women banked snow from north-facing walls. "You didn't just keep people alive," she said. "You changed how they see the mountain." Walter considered that. He had not intended change. He had intended shelter. But he knew, too, that survival often rearranged belief faster than argument ever could. James Kincaid returned with his son a week later, the boy carrying a notebook nearly as large as his chest. James himself looked altered. The tightness in his face eased his movements less guarded. He introduced the boy Michael, thin and sharp-eyed with his mother's pale hair, and a seriousness that came from watching adults fail and recover. Michael listened intently as Walter explained how stone held heat, how air moved if given a path. He asked careful questions, precise ones. Walter answered all of them, seeing in the boy a hunger for understanding rather than validation. It reminded him of himself once before. Experience hardened curiosity into caution. Soon others followed. Samuel Morrison arrived with rolled papers and charcoal smudges on his hands, his intellectual pride redirected rather than erased. He measured, sketched, recalculated, muttering to himself about thermal mass and ventilation, as if translating an old language into a new one. His wife Catherine stood nearby, healthier now. Color returned to her cheeks, watching the men with an expression that mixed relief and quiet amusement. She had learned the hard way which arguments were worth winning and which were worth surviving. Walter answered every question honestly, never hoarding knowledge as leverage. He spoke of mistakes he had made in earlier versions of the cabin of vents he had adjusted after listening to the wind of stones that cracked under stress and taught him restraint. When someone asked why he had trusted the cave when everyone else doubted it, Walter paused. He wiped his hands on his flannel fingers, rough and scarred, and said, "In war, the men who lived weren't always the strongest. They were the ones who noticed what others ignored and learned from it before it mattered." His voice was steady, carrying no bitterness. The words landed because they were earned. By early spring, the ridge looked different. Snow still clung to shaded pockets, but south-facing slopes showed bare earth. Cabins below sprouted changes, stone banked against north walls. Roofs extended to block wind, stoves rebuilt smaller but denser. People shared notes, tools, time. Pride softened into collaboration. The cave cabin became a place of reference rather than refuge, a quiet classroom where lessons were given without ceremony. Walter did not become a hero. He did not seek attention or tell stories of the storm unless asked directly. When a reporter from Denver drove up one afternoon, notebook ready, Walter declined politely and returned to his work. He was more interested in helping Thomas reposition a chimney than in being remembered. Legacy to him was not a thing you announced. It was something that happened when you weren't looking. Shadow spent more time at the cave mouth, now lying in the sun, his breathing slower, deeper. The storm had taken something from him, strength perhaps, but left him content. Walter often sat beside him in the evenings, one hand resting on the dog's broad back, feeling warmth rise through stone and bone alike. He thought about the men he had lost long ago, about how many winters they would never see. He thought about how close he had come to being alone again, and how preparation had widened that narrow margin between survival and regret. On a clear afternoon, as the town moved below, with cautious optimism, Sarah Whitaker joined him at the cave entrance. She stood quietly for a moment, then said, "They won't laugh again." Walter looked out over Leadville sunlight glinting off snowmelt and shook his head slightly. "Laughter isn't the enemy," he said. "It's forgetting to listen that gets people killed." Sarah nodded, absorbing that, and smiled faintly. When summer came, visitors still climbed the ridge, some out of curiosity, some out of gratitude. Walter greeted them all the same. He taught when asked, worked when needed, rested when the mountain allowed it. The cave remained what it had always been to him, not a monument, but a tool. A reminder that wisdom was rarely new and never loud, that it survived by being shared. And when winter returned the following year, it found a town quieter, more prepared, and less inclined to mock what it did not yet understand. At the cave mouth, Shadow lay watchful once more, and Walter Hayes stood beside him, a man shaped by loss and learning, content to be listened to rather than applauded. The mountain held them both, and Winter at last respected that. Sometimes God does not send thunder or angels or signs written across the sky. Sometimes the miracle comes quietly, shaped like a cave in a mountain, a steady fire, or a man who listens when others laugh. What saved those families was not luck, and it was not strength alone. It was preparation guided by wisdom, and wisdom is often the way God chooses to speak. Scripture tells us that the prudent see danger and take refuge. Walter did not build that shelter to be praised. He built it because he paid attention to creation, to hard-earned lessons, and to the responsibility we have to one another. In our own lives, the storms may not look like snow or wind. They come as illness, loneliness, financial worry, or seasons when the future feels cold and uncertain. And yet God still provides shelter, sometimes through a kind neighbor, sometimes through knowledge passed down, sometimes through a quiet voice reminding us to prepare to care and to stay humble. This story reminds us that faith is not only about waiting for miracles. It is also about recognizing them when they arrive, disguised as work, patience, and love. If this story touched you, take a moment to share it with someone who may need encouragement today. Let us know where you're watching from by leaving a comment below your city, your state, or your country. And if you believe that stories like this matter, please consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue sharing reminders of hope, wisdom, and grace. May God watch over you and your family. May He grant you warmth in cold seasons, strength in hard ones, and the humility to recognize His blessings when they appear in unexpected forms. Amen.